Emily sat on the couch, the hum of the television filling the empty space of her living room. The soft flicker of the screen reflected off the framed photos on the wall, pictures from better days. She and Ryan had been married for almost 8 years, and from the outside, everything looked perfect. They had a nice home in Seattle, stable jobs, a few close friends, and a quiet routine that looked comfortable. But lately, that comfort had turned into silence, and the silence had started to feel heavy. Ryan had changed. It wasn't sudden, but slow, so slow that Emily didn't notice it at first. The late nights at the office, the quick dinners, distracted nods when she talked about her day, all those little things had begun stacking up like invisible bricks between them. Once, he used to text her every few hours just to say he missed her. Now, the only messages she got were short updates: running late, don't wait for me. Meeting ran over. Simple words. But they carried a weight she couldn't ignore. That evening, she looked at the time, 9:42 p.m. and sighed. Ryan had said he'd be home by 8. The pasta she had made had gone cold an hour ago. She picked up her phone, thinking about calling him, but stopped. She didn't want to sound needy. She didn't want another quiet apology over the phone. Instead, she just sent a short message. Be safe. Don't work too hard. Then she placed the phone face down on the table and tried to focus on the movie playing in front of her. The movie ended, and the credits rolled. Ryan still hadn't come home. Emily turned off the TV and sat there, staring at the dark reflection of herself on the screen. She wasn't angry, just tired of missing someone who was technically right there, but emotionally miles away. When Ryan finally came through the door around midnight, she pretended to be asleep. She heard him drop his keys softly on the counter, his footsteps careful not to wake her. The faint smell of coffee and city air followed him into the bedroom. For a moment, she wanted to turn over and ask if he was okay. But she didn't. She stayed still, breathing slowly, hoping he couldn't hear the quiet ache in her chest. The next morning, the house was silent again. Ryan left early, as usual. Emily sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, staring at the sunlight streaming through the window. The golden light made everything look warm and peaceful, but she didn't feel either. The distance between them wasn't about space anymore, it was emotional. It felt like Ryan had built a wall between them without realizing it. And no matter what she did, she couldn't reach him. She remembered the early days when they'd laugh at everything. They used to cook together on Sundays, talk about their dreams, their plans for a family, the vacations they'd take. Now, those dreams had been replaced with silence and tired excuses. Life had turned into a routine series of days that looked the same but felt emptier each time. Emily thought about calling her best friend, Claire, to talk about it. But she didn't want to admit that her marriage was struggling. Everyone around her thought she and Ryan were perfect together. Admitting that things weren't okay felt like breaking something that wasn't supposed to break. That evening, Ryan texted again. Working late. Big project deadline. Emily read the message twice before replying with a simple, okay. Then she put the phone down and went to the balcony. The city lights glowed softly in the distance, the sound of cars humming below. She wrapped her arms around herself and let the cool breeze touch her face. For a moment, she wondered if he was really working or if something else was keeping him away. She shook the thought from her mind. Ryan wasn't that kind of man, she told herself. He had always been loyal, responsible, honest. But lately, honesty had started to sound like another word for distance. When Ryan came home that night, it was the same as before. He smiled faintly, kissed her forehead, and went straight to take a shower. She sat on the bed listening to the water running, her hands clasped together. He looked exhausted when he came out, so she didn't say much. She wanted to ask about his day, but his eyes were half closed. His mind already somewhere else. Good night, he murmured. Good night, she whispered back. Watching him turn away, the next few days felt like reruns of the same quiet movie. Emily woke up, made breakfast, and went to work. Ryan left early, came back late, and the distance between them stretched further. There were no arguments, no harsh words, no big fights. Just silence, the kind that hurts more than shouting ever could. One night, Emily found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone. There they were, laughing, kissing, holding hands at the beach. She smiled faintly at one picture from their first anniversary, where Ryan had surprised her with a candlelit dinner at home. He'd written "too many more years of us" on a note and tucked it under her plate. She still had that note folded neatly in her drawer. She stood up, walked to the drawer, and pulled it out. The paper was slightly worn at the edges, but the ink still looked fresh. She traced the words with her thumb, feeling a sting in her chest. When did I stop feeling like a promise and start feeling like a memory? That night, she couldn't sleep. She turned from one side to the other, staring at the dark outline of Ryan beside her. He was asleep, his breathing steady and calm. She wanted to reach out to touch his arm, to whisper that she missed him. But something stopped her. Maybe pride, maybe fear, maybe both. She got out of bed quietly, walked to the kitchen, and made herself a cup of tea. The digital clock on the stove blinked to 14 a.m. The house was silent except for the soft sound of the kettle cooling down. She sat by the window, looking out at the empty street. The loneliness she felt wasn't just because Ryan wasn't there, it was because he no longer saw her. Even when he was right in front of her, Emily thought about writing him a letter, telling him everything she felt. But she knew he'd probably be too tired to read it. Instead, she promised herself that tomorrow she'd talk to him face to face. She'd tell him she missed him, that something was wrong, that they couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. But tomorrow came, and when she woke up, Ryan was already gone. A note sat on the counter. Early meeting. Coffee's in the pot. Love you, she smiled weakly. Love you. Two simple words that felt lighter than they used to. She poured herself a cup, took a sip, and looked out the window again. The truth hit her quietly, without warning. They were still together, but they weren't close. The love was still there, but buried under distance, time, and silence. She didn't know how to fix it yet, but deep down, she knew something was coming. Something that would make her question everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and marriage. And that something would begin with a message she wasn't supposed to see. Saturday morning came quietly, with soft light slipping through the curtains. Emily woke up to an empty bed, Ryan's side already cold. She sat up slowly, her eyes heavy from another restless night. Downstairs, she could hear the faint hum of the coffee maker. Ryan's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter beside his travel mug. He must have forgotten it in a rush to work. She reached to move it out of the way, but a message flashed across the screen that stopped her hand. It was from someone named Sophie. The words were simple but sharp. Last night meant so much. You make everything feel alive again. Emily froze. Her heart skipped, then started racing so fast it hurt. She blinked, thinking she must have misread it. But the message stayed there, clear and cruel. For a few seconds, she just stood still, her fingers trembling slightly. Then she set the phone down carefully. As if touching it again might make the words vanisher, make them more real. Her thoughts spun in every direction. Who is Sophie? Why would someone say that? She wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe an old friend or a coworker joking. But deep down, she knew that tone. She'd used it once herself, back when she and Ryan had just started falling in love. The kitchen felt smaller, the air heavier. Emily leaned on the counter, her chest tight. She didn't cry, not yet. She just stood there in disbelief. Ryan had been distant for months, but she'd blamed work, stress, life. Never another person. Never this. She picked up the phone again, her thumb hovering over the screen. Should she look through the rest of the messages? She hesitated. Part of her didn't want to see more, didn't want to confirm what her heart already feared. Still, she opened the conversation. The messages were there, not many, but enough. Mostly short exchanges, warm, sometimes emotional. I missed our talks. You always know what to say. And then, that message from the night before. Emily felt something inside her break, but it wasn't loud. It was quiet, slow, like a crack running through glass. She closed the phone, put it back where she found it, and took a deep breath. The rest of the day moved in a blur. She couldn't focus on anything. Every sound felt distant. Every minute stretched too long. She tried to distract herself, cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, even watered the plants, but her mind kept circling back to that message. In the afternoon, she took a walk. The fall air was crisp, the streets scattered with yellow leaves. She walked past families laughing, couples holding hands, and it all felt so painfully far from her own reality. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ryan. "Sorry I left early. Be home late. Love you." She read it twice. "Love you." The same words he always used. The same words that now felt hollow. That evening, Emily didn't cook. She couldn't. The thought of sitting across from him, pretending everything was fine, felt impossible. When Ryan came home, he looked exhausted, his tie loose, his hair slightly messy. He smiled faintly when he saw her. "Hey, Em," he said softly, setting his bag down. "You okay?" Emily forced a small smile. "Yeah, just tired." He nodded, kissed her forehead, and walked past her. The smell of his cologne lingered, the same scent that used to comfort her. Now it made her stomach twist. She watched him go upstairs and wondered how many lies could fit into a single day. Later that night, she sat by the window while Ryan showered. The sound of running water filled the silence. She stared out at the quiet street, thinking about the years they had built together, birthdays, anniversaries, lazy Sundays. How could something so strong start to feel so fragile? Ryan came downstairs wearing a faded t-shirt and smiled when he saw her still awake. "You should sleep," he said gently. "You've been working too much lately." Emily looked at him, studying his face, the familiar eyes, the lines of fatigue around his mouth. She wanted to ask about Sophie right then. The words rose to her lips, but she swallowed them back. She wasn't ready. She needed to understand before she accused. She needed to know if what she saw was truly betrayal or something else. That night, she barely slept. The thought of that one message haunted her, repeating like a whisper she couldn't silence. "You make everything feel alive again." What did that mean? Was he falling for someone else? Was this emotional or something deeper? The next morning, Ryan left early again. Emily sat at the table, his phone still on the counter where he'd forgotten it again. Her heart raced. Maybe she was meant to see it. Maybe fate was pushing her toward the truth. This time she checked carefully. There were more messages, nothing explicit, nothing openly romantic, but too personal for comfort. They talked about memories, about life, about loneliness. Sophie mentioned how Ryan always knew how to listen. Ryan had replied, "You've been through a lot. You deserve someone who understands." Emily's throat tightened. It wasn't physical, but it was emotional, the kind of closeness that hurts more because it starts with kindness. She clicked on Sophie's profile. The photo showed a woman around their age, smiling, holding a coffee cup near a beach. There was warmth in her eyes and something gentle in her smile. Emily felt a strange mix of anger and pity. Whoever Sophie was, she wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that Ryan had opened a part of himself to someone else that used to belong to her. Emily locked the phone and sat down, staring at the floor. Her mind flashed through every moment of their marriage. How did they get here? Was it her fault too? Had she stopped listening when he needed her? The guilt and pain tangled together until she couldn't tell them apart. When Ryan returned that evening, Emily greeted him with calmness. She didn't feel. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice steady. "Busy, but good," he said, loosening his tie. "I think we're close to finishing that project." "That's good," she replied softly, pretending not to notice the way he avoided her eyes. After dinner, he sat on the couch scrolling through his phone. Emily watched quietly, waiting to see if he would react, if guilt would show in his expression. But he looked normal, even relaxed. The ease in his face almost made her angrier. She excused herself early and went upstairs. In bed, she stared at the ceiling, feeling 1,000 thoughts press against her heart. She wanted to scream, to cry, to confront him, but something held her back. Maybe fear? Maybe the hope that there was still a version of them that could be saved. The next morning, Emily woke up determined. She couldn't live in confusion anymore. If Ryan was hiding something, she needed to know what it was. She decided to find out who Sophie truly was, not out of revenge. But because she needed the truth to breathe again, she would start small, ask questions, notice details, pay attention to what Ryan said and didn't say. She didn't know what she'd find. But she knew one thing for certain. The distance between them wasn't just growing anymore. It was changing everything. And as she looked at his forgotten phone one last time, she whispered to herself, whatever the truth is, I'm ready to face it. What Emily didn't know was that finding the truth would hurt even more than the lie. Emily's heart was restless in the days that followed. She woke up each morning with the same ache in her chest, the same thought repeating in her mind. Who is Sophie, and what does she mean to him? She didn't want to spy, but she couldn't ignore it anymore. Every time Ryan smiled at his phone or left the room to take a call, the question burned deeper. She started paying closer attention. The tone of his voice, the small changes in his routine, the way he sometimes looked at her like he wanted to say something but didn't. There was guilt in his eyes. She could feel it. But there was also something else, sadness. It wasn't the look of a man who didn't care. It was the look of someone trapped between two worlds. One evening, while Ryan was in the shower, Emily sat on the bed and opened his laptop. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, her conscience whispering that this wasn't right. But she needed the truth more than peace. She searched his email, his chats, and found one message from Sophie. Short and simple. Thank you for talking last night. You always make me feel less alone. Her chest tightened. It wasn't a confession, but it was intimacy, the kind that forms when someone shares their soul instead of their body. She scrolled up and saw older emails. That's when she realized Sophie wasn't some random woman. She was Ryan's ex-girlfriend from college, the one he had once mentioned briefly years ago. They dated for almost 3 years before breaking up when life took them in. Different directions. The discovery made Emily pause. Sophie wasn't a stranger. She was a memory brought back to life. Emily leaned back in her chair, staring blankly at the screen. So that's why Ryan never mentioned her again. It wasn't because he forgot, it was because he never truly let her go. She read one more message. Sophie had written, "It's strange talking to you again after all this time. I feel like I'm talking to an old version of myself." Ryan's reply came just minutes later. "You haven't changed much. You were always the one who understood me best." Emily's hands trembled. It wasn't physical cheating, but it was emotional, and sometimes that hurt more. He was giving another woman what he used to give her, his thoughts, his comfort, his trust. She closed the laptop slowly, her eyes blurring with tears. When Ryan came out of the shower, he noticed her red eyes. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, walking closer. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a smile. But her voice cracked slightly, and Ryan noticed. He sat beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You seem distant lately," he said softly. "Is something wrong?" That question stung. Was something wrong? He had no idea how much his actions had already changed everything. She wanted to say, "You are what's wrong," but instead she shook her head. "Just tired," she whispered. That night she couldn't sleep again. She turned to look at him in the dark, wondering if he was dreaming about her or someone else. The silence between them was louder than ever. The next day, she decided she couldn't live in confusion anymore. She called her best friend Claire and told her everything. Claire listened quietly before saying, you need to talk to him. Don't guess what's in his heart. Ask him." That advice stayed with her all day. When Ryan came home that evening, she was ready. She had spent hours rehearsing what to say, but when she saw him, all her words vanished. He looked so normal, so unaware of the storm inside her. They ate dinner quietly, the sound of forks scraping plates filling the silence. Finally, she set her fork down. "Ryan, can we talk?" she asked. He looked up immediately. "Of course. What's wrong?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I found your messages with Sophie." The air went still. Ryan's face froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Emily," he began, but she cut him off. "I just want the truth. Who is she to you?" He sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. For a moment he said nothing, just rubbed his temples. Then he looked at her, guilt clear in his eyes. "She's my ex from college," he admitted quietly. "Her husband passed away a few months ago. She reached out one night just to talk. I didn't think much of it. I was trying to be kind." Emily's voice was calm but trembling. "Kindness doesn't sound like you understand me better than anyone." Ryan looked down. "You're right," he whispered. "It went too far. Not physically, but emotionally, yes. I didn't mean for it to. He stopped, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't even realize how lonely I'd become." Those words hit Emily harder than she expected. Lonely. That was exactly how she had felt too. Maybe they'd both been drifting, lost in silence, not realizing how far apart they'd gone. "Why didn't you come to me?" she asked, her tone softer now, filled more with pain than anger. Ryan's eyes glistened. "Because I didn't know how to. Every time I looked at you, I saw how tired you were, how distant. I didn't want to make it worse. Then Sophie messaged me, and suddenly it felt easy to talk again. I know that's no excuse, but I just needed someone to listen." Emily leaned back, tears pooling in her eyes. "You could have told me you were lonely. I would have listened. I've been missing you too." He looked up, his face filled with regret. "I know, and I hate that I made you feel small. I hate that I hurt you." The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the silence that follows truth, heavy, real, painful, but freeing. After a long pause, Emily said softly, "You didn't just talk to her, Ryan. You shared yourself with her. That's what hurts." Ryan nodded slowly. "I know, and I'll do anything to earn your trust back. I ended it with her. I told her I couldn't keep talking. You deserve my honesty, even if I gave it too late." Emily studied him carefully. She could see the sincerity in his face, but trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt in one night. It would take time if it was even possible. She stood up quietly and said, "I need space to think." Ryan didn't argue. He just nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll give you whatever you need. I just don't want to lose you." That night, Emily slept in the guest room. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything they'd shared and everything they'd lost. It wasn't about another woman anymore. It was about what they had let fade between them. She didn't know what the future would hold. But she knew one thing: love couldn't survive without truth. And now that truth was out. Their marriage would either heal or break for good. As the first light of morning touched the window, Emily whispered to herself, "I loved him once enough to fight for him. Maybe I can love him enough to forgive him." But forgiveness, she knew, wouldn't come easy. It would take honesty, patience, and a choice, one that would define whether this story ended in heartbreak or hope. The next morning was gray and quiet. Rain tapped softly on the window, and the air inside the house felt thick with everything that had been said and everything still unspoken. Emily woke up in the guest room, her head heavy from a sleepless night. She could hear Ryan moving downstairs, the sound of the coffee maker, a cabinet closing, footsteps pacing slowly. For a long moment she stayed still, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the years that had brought them here. She wasn't angry anymore, not in the way she had been the night before. What she felt now was emptiness, the kind that follows after a storm. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. She couldn't pretend Sophie didn't exist, couldn't erase the messages, couldn't unhear the words Ryan had said. But beneath all that pain, there was still love, bruised, shaken, but alive. She got up, put on a sweater, and went downstairs. Ryan was sitting at the table, his coffee untouched. He looked up the second she entered, his eyes filled with quiet hope and fear. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning," she replied, sitting across from him. The silence that followed was long, but different from before. This wasn't the cold silence of distance, it was the heavy pause before something honest. "I ended everything with her," Ryan said finally, his voice steady but low. "I told Sophie I couldn't talk to her anymore. She understood. She said she didn't want to come between us." Emily nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said, though her tone carried both pain and uncertainty. Ryan's hands trembled slightly as he spoke again. I'm sorry, Emily, I never meant to hurt you. I didn't even realize how far apart we drifted until it was too late. I should have come to you. I should have fought harder for us. She looked at him, seeing the exhaustion and guilt written all over his face. He looked smaller somehow. Not the confident man she'd married, but someone stripped of all pride, holding nothing but regret. Why didn't you? She asked quietly. Why didn't you just tell me you were unhappy? Ryan sighed, staring down at his hands. Because I didn't want to admit it. I thought if I just worked harder, things would fix themselves. But the harder I tried to avoid the problem, the worse it got. Talking to Sophie reminded me of a version of myself I hadn't felt in years. Carefree, understood. But then I realized that I didn't want to go back to who I was. I wanted to find who I could still be. With you. Emily's throat tightened. The words were raw, real. She wanted to believe him, and a part of her already did. It's not that simple, Ryan, she whispered. You broke something I trusted completely. I don't even know how to look at you the same way. I know, he said, his voice shaking. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right if you let me. For a few minutes, they just sat there. The sound of rain filled the room, gentle and steady. Emily looked out the window, remembering the early years of their marriage, the long drives, the laughter, the late-night talks about everything and nothing. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped being teammates and started living like strangers under the same roof. Do you love me? She asked suddenly. Ryan looked at her, his eyes glistening. More than I've ever said out loud, he replied. Even when I was lost, even when I was stupid enough to look for connection somewhere else, it was always you. It's always been you. Honesty hit her like a wave. It hurt, but it also melted something inside her that had been frozen for months. She wanted to be angry, but all she felt was tired. Tired of running from the truth. Tired of pretending they couldn't find their way back. Then we start over, she said finally, her voice steady but soft. But it won't be easy and it won't be fast. You'll have to earn my trust again every single day. Ryan nodded quickly, relief washing over his face. I will, he promised. Whatever it takes. That weekend, Emily suggested they go for a drive, somewhere quiet, away from the noise of the city. Ryan agreed immediately. They drove 2 hours north to a lake they used to visit when they first started dating. The same wooden dock still stretched out over the calm water. And the same trees stood around it like silent witnesses of time. They sat side by side, their feet dangling above the water. For a while, neither spoke. The silence was peaceful, healing. The kind that lets old wounds breathe. I used to come here when I needed to think, Emily said softly. It always reminded me of us. Simple, quiet, real. Ryan smiled faintly. This is where I first knew I wanted to marry you, he said. I remember you laughing at something stupid I said, and I thought, I never want to stop hearing that laugh. Emily looked at him, her eyes wet with both sadness and warmth. Then why did we forget how to listen to each other? Ryan shook his head slowly. Because we stopped trying. Life got loud and we stopped choosing each other every day. But I want to change that. I want to show up again. For the first time in months, Emily reached for his hand. It felt familiar but different, like holding on to something fragile but still worth saving. He looked at her, surprised but grateful, and gently squeezed her fingers. I'm not promising I'll forget, she said quietly, but maybe I can forgive. Ryan's eyes filled with emotion. That's more than I deserve, but it's all I could ever ask for. They sat there as the wind brushed against the lake, rippling the water. It wasn't a fairy tale moment. There were no grand speeches or perfect endings. Just two people, broken but willing to rebuild. When they drove back home that evening, the car was quiet, but the silence felt different now, softer, less heavy. There was still hurt between them, but also hope. Days turned into weeks, and small changes began to appear. Ryan started coming home early. They cooked dinner together again, talked more, laughed sometimes. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. There were awkward moments and quiet tears. but also small victories, like the first time Emily smiled at one of his jokes again, or the night they stayed up late talking until sunrise. Healing didn't happen overnight, but it was happening slowly, honestly. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset from their porch, Ryan turned to her and said, "Thank you for not giving up on us." Emily looked at him, her eyes soft. "I almost did," she admitted, "but I remembered who we were before the distance, and I wanted to believe we could find our way back." He took her hand again and whispered, "I put big distance between us, Em, and I'm sorry for how hard I made it to love me." She smiled faintly. "Then stop saying sorry," she said. "Just love me better." And he did, not with grand gestures, but with consistency, honesty, and patience. Emily knew their story wasn't perfect, but it was real, raw, and human. Sometimes love doesn't end with fireworks or tragedy. Sometimes it ends with forgiveness, quiet and slow. The kind that takes courage to give and strength to accept as the sun dipped below the horizon. Emily leaned her head on Ryan's shoulder and whispered, "We're not who we used to be. But maybe that's okay." And in that simple, peaceful moment, they both knew they were choosing each other again,